Welcome to Sector Report. I'm David Beatson. This week, why is the government putting the emissions trading scheme in the deep freezer? What's Labor got to say about biosecurity and other hot farming issues? And can country communities survive as their youngsters leave the district?
You're coming from a closed school, and I think that's a bit of a perception out there that something must have gone wrong, where nothing did. It's just we ran out of kids.
Well, for the first time in 2 years, the exodus of young New Zealanders to Australia looks like slowing down. But it may be happening too late for some of our rural communities where populations are already shrinking with the normal drift of young people from country into town and on to big cities here and overseas. Our correspondent John Watson's running a check on the slowing rural pulse in the heart of Hawke's Bay.
You come to school and it's quiet and it's just depressing. It's quite depressing not hearing the kids' voices and having, even the squabbles. We miss the squabbles, and we turn the radio on and we sit with the adults, and sometimes you're here by yourself, and that's particularly depressing and particularly lonely.
Each morning by 9 o'clock, Sharon Middleton turns up to school. Only there are no children to teach. Her last 2 students were sent to a bigger school in the district. For over a month now, she's been waiting for word from the Ministry of Education to close.
I think that's a bit of a perception out there that something must have gone wrong, where nothing did. It's just we ran out of kids.
And now the small community of Awaroa is about to run out of its only building.
They don't want to spend money on fixing it up, so they'll probably bulldoze it, and sheep will be where we're sitting right now.
This is all that remains of another school in the area that closed in 1965. Its pupils at the time were absorbed into Awaroa School. It's a standing reminder of a phenomenon that's been taking place for centuries, rural to urban migration. Awaroa paints a scene in a bigger picture. Virtually all of New Zealand's remote rural areas will experience population decline in the next 20 years. Add on top of this an ageing population as baby boomers go into retirement, and the once green landscape starts looking increasingly grey. For the first time, the number of people over 65 in our rural communities will effectively double, and there will be more deaths than births. And their grandchildren are leaving for cities with jobs and universities.
What you've got now is rural regions that are lacking kids, they're lacking young people in the, say, 20 to 24-year age groups. And if you don't have those people, the whole thing just sort of spirals down to a picture of an ageing population, a dramatically ageing population out in the rural areas. Yeah, when I
Natalie Jackson grew up in a small rural town and now works as a professor of demography at Waikato University. The outlook for areas like the one she grew up in concerns her.
That's a really worrying thing. Now, school closures are actually critically important. So the school is the heart of a rural community. Once you close a school, more people will move away. The rest of your dynamic young population will go.
Mark Humphreys continued the family tradition by going to Awaroa School and taking over the family farm. His father David went to the school the year it opened and took over the farm from his father. Now his family's future in the community weighs upon his shoulders.
I'm the 3rd generation on this farm, and that's part of a small part of why we do it. One day one of our children might want to take over the land at one point.
Mark wasn't the only parent battling to save the school.
As a community, we continued to support it through fundraising for 2 or 3 years, but you were never going to get it back to where it needed to go.
Charlie Patterson was at the school in the mid-60s. He remembers it in its heyday.
We've had some hellish good times there, and we've met some very good friends, and it was a great way of at least once or twice a year the community getting together and basically having a barbecue, or it might be at the school prize giving, and we had Father Christmas turn up and that type of thing. The reality is you have to face the inevitable. perhaps...
Since then, he's seen the community deteriorate, in some respects, quite literally.
They raised their family here, but none of their children are now farming. And I think that's an issue in itself. They've all gone off and done other things, so eventually chose to just close it up and leave it.
The day after we spoke, Charlie's son James returned home from his OE, having driven tractors outside of London for over a year.
When I was his age, I was the eldest son, and I was pretty well told, as a lot of us were, that you're the eldest son, you'll be farming. This will be yours one day.
So do you have plans to take over the farm?
I mean, I could come back to the farm and that's all good, but after, say, 10, 15 years, I'm just going to get over it and probably end up selling up or something like that.
In the end, you could say what's happening in the remote rural areas is part of a really big global force of agglomeration that kind of starts with the main big cities in the world and ends up in the rural black bloc, say, of Southland or of the far north in New Zealand.
So you could say, as a general statement, the bigger the city, the faster its growth, and the smaller the rural town, the more rapid its decline.
That would be a fair representation of what's going on globally, yeah.
As a nation of farming, it may come as a surprise to hear that New Zealand is one of the most urbanised countries in the world. Over half our population growth occurs here in Auckland, and this is projected to increase to 2/3. Once other cities have taken their slice of the population pie, our rural areas will be lucky to get any crumbs.
For me, it's worrying if towns and local governments, for example, don't really understand what's going on, that all they need to do is build a new swimming pool and they'll entice people to their region. But what people don't realise is the real impact of declining birth rates over the last, it's been over half a century that birth rates have been falling.
We went to meet the Mayor of the Central Hawke's Bay, Peter Butler, to see how much of a handle he had on the situation. Have you got any measures or plans in place to address a changing population in your region?
Nothing comes to mind. Changing population. We're looking after our younger generation. At the moment, a great big all-weather turf is being proposed for Waipakarau. This is for our younger people.
He says he doesn't believe figures released by Statistics New Zealand that show a population decline in all ages except for over 65s in his region.
For them to say we've lost 140 is a load of, yeah, I'm not too sure how to say it, but it's a load of something, and I take no notice of it.
I think you've got to look at the bigger picture and recognise there is a need for this type of little school, family orientated. If you're achieving success with even one kid, you've made a difference in a life.
But will these views from people like Sharon be enough to ensure the survival of communities like Awaroa, or are they destined to become yet another dot on the landscape?
Towns grow up and they can't always go on. They exist for a time, and we have to take that longer view of it.
The world is full of bleak numbers. It's our challenge to do something about it. I don't think we should be defeatist and just say, hey, this is terrible, but we can't do anything about it. I think the benefit of these projections is that they are a warning signal and they allow people to actually act upon them.
You can't bash your head against a brick wall. We all know what we would love to have happen. We'd love our local schools and that to continue existing, but you've got to have the kids there to make it work. And it's just the way things are now.
So what do you do all day here?
We just wait at this stage and wait and wait and wait.
Indeed, it's only a matter of time until the lights at Awaroa School, at least, are turned off for the last time.
John Watson reporting, and Sharon Middleton did get that phone call from the Ministry of Education. The school officially closed on Friday the 13th, as fate would have it. Coming up, are we going cold on climate change? Welcome back to Sector Report. Well, the government has decided to put the brakes on the next phase of its emission trading scheme. It won't phase out the carbon credit relief granted to emitters like oil and electricity companies that was due to go at the end of the year. The carbon credit price is staying capped at $25 a tonne, and the exemption for agriculture is going to continue at least till 2015. But what's made the government decide to stall the scheme? That's the question for Climate Change Minister Tim Grosser. Minister, thanks for joining us. First of all, what has changed that required you to change the plan?
I think the answer to that, David, is that the international situation hadn't, in our view, fundamentally changed, and therefore the measures that we introduced when we became the government to deliberately soften the economic impact of the scheme were still valid. So we didn't want to accelerate beyond that. Apart from that, the reality is that although New Zealand's had 10 out of, I think, the last 11 quarters with positive growth, all of us know Kiwis are doing it hard out there. And we didn't think it was right time to put new costs on households and the businesses that employ them.
Prime Minister said we're not prepared to sacrifice jobs. Were there going to be job losses if you'd stuck with the plan?
Well, certainly a number of businesses in the very extensive consultations we had indicated to us that some of them were in no position to take on these additional costs. So the answer has to be yes, in principle, absolutely.
Can we turn now to the matters relating to agriculture,
sure,
and particularly forestry? So you have addressed some of the forestry issues.
Yes, we have, and let me say I fully and other ministers fully understand that at current very low levels of carbon prices, it's a very weak incentive to grow trees solely for the carbon. So we do understand their concerns, but at the end of the day, we're not about to deliberately go for a scheme that seeks to de-link the New Zealand carbon price from the international carbon price. So obviously certain people will invest in forestry for the long-term return of the softwood rather than the sequestered carbon in it. We're giving them a weaker signal, we do understand that, but at the end of the day we have to balance that against the households and businesses that would have to pay for that.
Yeah, one of the suggestions that was made was that perhaps there should be some proportion of the carbon credits that were being purchased by emitters that had to be purchased in New Zealand credits.
Well, what
we're going to about that?
We're going to introduce a system of auctioning to make sure that emitters who still need to surrender New Zealand units to account for their emissions on the agreed formula, that there's sufficient New Zealand units available. The details of that we have to develop, and we'll develop that over the next few months.
Okay, you also had a look at the pre-1990 forests, and you've made some changes there too.
Yes, we're going to allow offsetting now for pre-90 forests. Obviously this has nothing to do with our wonderful indigenous forests. I think something like 6.8 million hectares of it. That's completely another out of the frame. So yes, that will be an option, and that's because of the success that New Zealand had in Durban at the last ministerial climate change talks in getting this land use flexibility rule changed to meet the circumstances of plantation forests. So, there'll be a number of foresters who will take that up. I think the advice I'm getting from our side is that it's not going to be a bonanza, but certainly for some people it'll be useful.
As I understand the situation, you could either offset by planting new trees somewhere else if you were milling a pre-1990 forest, or you could choose not to, and then you would be entitled to some recompense because you hadn't claimed for the trees that you milled.
Correct. So there will be compensation for those who don't take up offsetting.
Is that likely to be costly?
Well, I mean...
Have you got an estimate?
Yes. The total fiscal cost of the whole package, according to the advice the Cabinet was given, was $328 million over 4 years, and that's a component of it. For those people who do take up offsetting, of course, they have to find some alternative land, don't need to own it, and they can lease it, obviously, and plant an equivalent forest, and they will not be entitled to compensation, clearly.
I want to turn now to the matter of the performance of farmers to date. I mean, one of the underestimated factors in a lot of the debate about agriculture being excluded in terms of biological emissions is that farmers have been doing quite a bit to reduce other emissions. Is this being fully recognised?
Well, I'm very conscious of this. The average New Zealand meat and dairy producer has been reducing her or his emissions by around about 1.3% per annum for the last 20 years. That's measured in terms of the solid output or protein output. So, I mean, that's an amazing achievement.
Is anyone else doing that kind of thing in agriculture around the world?
And
yet that's an opportunity.
I have to say, it's quite frustrating in a sense that my view is that New Zealand is doing more in this area of agriculture emissions by a country mile, no pun intended, of course, than any other country in the world. So we have got, first of all, our farmers are the most carbon efficient farmers in the world in terms of all these studies that I've seen referenced. Secondly, of course, we are taking on emissions in producing food for other people and then exported the embedded emissions in our wonderful food products. If they were produced in China, the emissions that they would use would be far higher than in New Zealand. And finally, of course, I think the icing on the cake is the Global Research Alliance on Agriculture Emissions, which we've set up, is going astonishingly well, and really we have to find technological solutions here.
Final question. Does putting the brakes on what we were going to do undermine your position in both the negotiations for a new international regime on emissions reduction and indeed in terms of any trade deals that we've got in the pipeline?
Well, categorically no to both questions. Nobody has ever raised climate change in a single trade negotiation that I've been involved in, ever. With respect to climate change, it's important New Zealand has a credible position. Of course, we do play an extraordinarily large role in international climate change negotiations. I'm off to Berlin tonight for a invited group, a small group of ministers. So we chair the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, Dr. Adrian Macy, and I ended up chairing in Durban the other side of that negotiation called technically the Long-Term Cooperative Action Track, or LCA Track. So we do play a very large role, but it's not, I don't think, because people see us as having the neatest, cleanest or whatever emissions trading scheme. It's just we've got to have a credible response, and we are credible by any relative international standard.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Minister for Climate Change and Trade, Tim Grosser. And next, what's Labor saying about biosecurity and other hot farming topics? You stay with Sector Report. The government's reeling from two setbacks on the biosecurity front this month. First, the damning findings from an independent review of the Ministry of Primary Industries' role in the kiwifruit PSA crisis. Second, a court decision to extend its prohibition on the import and release of consumer-ready cuts of fresh pork until New Zealand Pork has its case against the move heard by the Court of Appeal. And with more, here's Labour's spokesperson on agriculture, Damien O'Connor. Damien O'Connor, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, David.
Now, you have said that the government is pandering to foreign interests in ignoring the views of the industry on the import of fresh pork. What exactly do you mean?
Well, we here import about 800 tonnes of pork a week, so we're not trying to block this. There are strict standards around biosecurity now to protect us from PRRS, which is the pork equivalent of AIDS, I guess. They don't like saying that. We are one of two countries that do not have it, us in Australia. And there's a push to import bigger chunks of meat, which the industry believe contain a higher level of risk. I believe them, and I think that they have every right to say, hold on, we bring it in now, why increase the risk? The reasons are that I think the government's not prepared to stand up to some of the trade negotiators, some of the retailers who say, we want larger volumes of pork because we can get it cheaper.
Labor did free trade deals and did trade negotiations. I mean, did we ever say that we wouldn't open our market up to a trade partner's meat exports? After all, we want to export fresh meat to them.
We let the pork in now, but we have strict controls around it, and the proposal is to lower the standards and the protections through the import health standards. They're going to lower that standard of protection for us, and every trade agreement allows us to maintain the proper level of protection, and this government's determined to push ahead with a lower level.
Let me just move on to another area because we've got another biosecurity issue you've been active about. You've been looking at the findings of the Superi review on the ministry's performance with regard to kiwifruit and the PSA problem. Why did you single out in your criticism the resource available for proper scientific and risk-based assessment?
Well, because right up front in the executive summary of the report, it identifies perhaps the need for MPI to reprioritise on the basis of its limited resources. That clearly identifies the fact that they can't do these things properly because they don't have the funding. And when you read through the report, there's 131 pages of it, it shows and exposes the flaws in the scientific analysis, and perhaps if there'd been more resource to go back and review that initial scientific report, we may have reached a different conclusion. Look, it's full of flaws from top to bottom in the biosecurity system, and that is alarming. You
were actually standing in for the Minister of Biosecurity in 2003,
yes,
when there had been an outbreak of what they call post-weaning multisystemic wasting syndrome, yes, in Northland. And at that time, there was a real barney going on. You were asked, what's your reaction to the fact the Pork Industry Board says we've got expert epidemiology and veterinarians to say that there's a 50% chance of eradicating this, and you had an answer which said nowhere in the world has eradication been carried out.
And I think that's
was that
the problem.
Advice? Did you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Same
advice.
source?
I mean, I don't profess to be a scientist, and most politicians will rely on that advice. It's really important that we push back and ask the hard questions of our officials. The fact is that most of these things are irreversible. That's why frontline biosecurity at the border and all the risk assessment at the border before something comes in is paramount.
Yeah, but in this case it was an endemic disease anyway. It was here. We had it and it cropped up. But you were being advised that there was no evidence that eradication had worked, and they were saying, look, we've got experts saying there's a 50% chance that we can do it.
And I think there have been those discussions. There always will be at political level. I'm not saying that every decision I made as a minister was right or wrong, and I think that, you know, that's what we get lined up for as politicians. Do we make the right or wrong calls? But we need to ensure that we're getting the right scientific analysis. That's important. That we do the right risk assessment. That's important, that ultimately the level of resource going in allows that proper two-stage process. In the end, it's often a political decision, and we get judged on that.
Emissions trading scheme.
Yes.
The government's reviewed and changed its position on the ETS, and I'm wondering whether you think that Labor ought to have a review of its position, particularly in regard to biological emissions from agriculture.
We haven't announced, and we're not discussing a review at this point. We are in the emissions trading scheme at this point. Every New Zealander is paying, including farmers.
Agreed.
We have obligations,
yeah.
and in 1997, of course, National, through Simon Upton, committed New Zealand to the agricultural emissions. So we're actually liable for those now because of that commitment. The issue is who pays. And in discussing this with farmers last night, they actually reluctantly but accepted that, well, we should all pay a fair share. The question is how much and how we transition into that. And I think that the national government's just taken a cheap and easy option just to push back on it, instead of saying, look, we're committed to the emissions trading scheme. We're committed to Kyoto. We have to make sure that everyone pays their fair share, keeping in mind the reality that for farmers you can't eliminate it.
Let me get this straight. You had an election policy which said we're going to bring agriculture in.
Yes.
Okay.
As National has said too.
Yeah, sometime post-2015. Now, I mean, is that the same time frame you're working to?
No, we haven't reviewed, we haven't committed to that. We haven't changed our dates, and it was originally 2013. And we will look at all of those policy areas before the next election, and you can ask me those hard questions then. The issue though is that is National just pushing it back for simple political reasons, and should it not be, you know, actually talking with the farmers to work out the most sensible way of including agriculture, not undermining their ability to make a profit and make a good return, but actually accepting the reality that National committed New Zealand to agricultural emissions in 1997, and we now have to deliver on that. At the moment, the national government's in power, it's making the calls.
Sure,
it's important that they make the right ones.
You're telling me you're going to do one?
We'll be going through all our policies, that we've committed to that from top to bottom to make sure we have the best policies, and hopefully we can get into government at the next election.
David O'Connor, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Labour's agriculture spokesperson Damien O'Connor. And that's all from Sector Report for now. Remember, you can check out our programs anytime online at country99tv.co.nz. Thanks for your company. I'm David Beatson. See you next time.